Hey, this is Javier. It's like 200 degrees outside right now, downtown Austin, Texas. We're fixing to walk around Lady Bird Lake a little bit. Hopefully, we get some nice little pictures, nice little video. Y'all get to see it. Hey, everybody, this is Javier. We're at the Susanna Dickinson Museum, and I have Miss Mary here with me, who's going to walk me around and give me some vital information that I need about Miss Susanna Dickinson. What do you got, man?
Okay, so if you want just a couple of sentences of background again on the Texas Revolution, basically the revolution started for several reasons. I would say there were two main conflicts that kick-started it. The first of which was that the Mexican government, at that point, Texas was just a part of Mexican territory, so it wasn't its own state or republic or anything like that. And American colonists were asked to come down by the Mexican government and start fresh in some of the early colonies. And the incentive for this was that in order to hold the territory, Texas had historically been a very difficult territory to hold. And Mexico wanted people to settle down as citizens in order to keep that territory. They also wanted to create almost a human buffer between the Native American populations and the Mexican populations, due to the fact that there was lots of fighting between the two already. So in order to get colonists to come down, they gave them lots of tax cuts, and laws were pretty lax. People wanted to, join colonies to start fresh. So there were a lot of reasons to move down. When people got there, they were quite unhappy. When Santa Anna took over, tax cuts kind of ended, laws got a lot stricter, and also they didn't receive aid from the government in order to defend themselves from Native American attacks, which they'd never been really promised in the first place, but they were upset about that. And then the other main reason was that Mexico was way ahead of the US and had already dismantled slavery or was in the process of it, and colonists were bringing in enslaved people. So those two things mixed together started a huge conflict. And I would say, the Alamo is just one of many battles, but it has become a big part of Texas culture, as we know. And there are many reasons for that. I mean, it was an interesting battle. It was a 13-day siege. And on the final day of the siege, the Texan forces were almost all killed. So they had been holed up in the Alamo, which was an old Spanish mission located in San Antonio, and the Mexican forces had surrounded them. When they came in and killed the Texan forces, they spared the women, children, and enslaved people. So for a long time, we thought Susanna Dickinson was the only survivor. Turns out there were actually 21 survivors. Our temporary exhibit right now, if you want to take a look around after that, is about the other survivors and their stories. But Susanna did have a very interesting story. She was asked to deliver the news of the Alamo's fall from General Santa Anna of the Mexican forces to General Sam Houston of the Texan forces. So, if you want to come in here to our...
Well, it's the story. Once the Alamo actually ends, that's kind of like the end of the story. Nobody knows what happens after.
Exactly. And that's one of the things to really appreciate about this museum is that's her key role in history and the thing that everyone remembers her for. And so that's how we start our tours and talk about it. But the rest of her life was quite interesting. And it's actually very rare that, particularly women in Texas history, we have their full narrative in their lives. But because of her involvement in the Alamo, we have much more information about her. So her last little bit in, the actual her historical significance in the eyes of most is that she, when she carried the word of the fall, she had just lost her husband, Amram Dickinson, and she had also her 14-month-old child with her, and she'd been shot in the leg. So it was quite a difficult journey that she made. This is one of the main illustrations of it. She is, as you can see, not alone. She's accompanied on horseback in the back by a servant of Santa Anna's named Ben. She is also accompanied by Joe, who was an enslaved man who fought for the Texan forces but was spared due to the fact that he wasn't fighting of his own free will. So Susanna and Joe gave most of the eyewitness accounts going into the future, but for the rest of her life, Susanna became the main source of information on the Alamo. The rest of her life was, as I said, quite interesting. She was born in 1814 in Tennessee. She married at the age of 15. She actually, her husband was 30, Almiron. He was actually a blacksmith. And he proposed to her. She said no. He proposed to her best friend. The best friend said yes. On the way to the chapel, she was actually supposed to be a bridesmaid. And they changed their mind and they took off and eloped together, which was pretty uncool. But at least she was 15. We can kind of give her a break. But he was 30, so he probably should have known better. But they really got the heck out of Dodge because they moved all the way to Texas. And they settled down in one of the first colonies, Gonzales. He actually moved her to San Antonio, where he was stationed as the captain of artillery in order to keep her safe. Obviously, that didn't work out. It turned into a war zone. But following that, and following her, again, main role in history, she joined what was called the Runaway Scrape. So she had to make her way to Houston. And this is a little-known period of Texas history in which women and children whose husbands had either died fighting in the war or who were currently in battle were asked to move further back into the Texas territory and the U.S. territory away from the Mexican troops. It was requested that they burn their belongings and their homesteads and their towns so as not to provide resources for the Mexican troops. This obviously was quite difficult considering not long after Texas won the revolution, they were asked to turn back and nothing remained. On top of that, as you know, the Texas terrain is incredibly dangerous. It's not a pleasant place to walk through. And on top of that, disease is really rampant. Many people died. Susanna and her child survived. They made their way to Houston, settled down. At this point, she was a war widow. She'd been injured. She had a small child with her. So she had to marry again immediately. Her second husband was unfortunately incredibly abusive. She actually got one of the first divorces in Houston. And following that, she married yet again. Her next husband either died of alcoholism or tuberculosis. We're not quite sure. After that, she married yet again, and her fourth marriage, this was her second to longest marriage, at some point during this relationship, she received money from the government that was owed to her as a war widow that she'd applied for many years ago, as many other war widows did. Basically, her husband was owed money and land from the Alamo for his role in the Alamo, and that was supposed to be given to her as compensation. So she received this money and this land, and she was actually able to keep that property. She sold the land, took the money, opened up her own boarding house in Lockhart, Texas. She was illiterate, but ran her own business. At this point, her husband was still living in Houston. She was living in Lockhart. As you might know, that is a very long way away, especially during the time. So they were doing a bit of long distance that clearly was not very successful, considering he accused her of prostitution, adultery, and running a brothel. We don't really know the truth of this. We do know that she worked in a famous brothel, but it was more likely that she was working in service and upkeep because she'd taken in lots of boarders before. And that was for a short period of time. We know that the boarding house she was running at that point was a genuine boarding house because of many records we have. We also know that that was one of the only ways you could get a divorce, and it wasn't uncommon for husbands to accuse their wives of that in order to get one. So we don't really know the truth of that, but either way, she bounced back very quickly. She married her fifth and final husband, fifth time's the charm, Joseph Hannig, who was a German immigrant and cabinet maker. They settled down in Austin together. She sold her boarding house and threw in her lot with him. And by the time they made it here, their first home was flooded from the Colorado River, which used to happen all the time before the dam was built. And they made quite a lot of money when they settled down and built this house. And that was due to the fact that Joseph was incredibly talented as a carpenter. He made this chest of drawers here, which, as you can see, is very German in style in comparison to a lot of the more English furniture in the room. It was very unique, and he was successful in selling his own. But on top of that, he was a big entrepreneur and started doing what not many people were doing at that point, which was selling furniture wholesale. So he opened up a store about a block down from here, And he began selling other sets of furniture made by other artisans. So, for example, these three pieces we have here, this set was something that he sold in his store. And he continued to do this. He became a coffin maker, an undertaker. He dabbled in real estate. He, on top of that, became an alderman. He was kind of a jack of all trades. And he made, again, quite a lot of money. They became very prominent in Austin society. And so they were married for about 26 years and are buried together in Oakwood Cemetery. As far as we know, it was a relatively happy marriage. But the house itself has really been through the ringer. So it's quite repaired and restored. Mostly what's left is the foundations. Unlike Theo Henry next door, which everything is original, in this home, though it is the oldest residence in Texas, or in Austin, it is, in the 1920s, it was an auto mechanic repair shop. For about 30 years, it was a barbecue joint. So it's been through quite a lot, and it had to be heavily excavated. It was where the Hilton Hotel is now, and they actually just moved it across the street in 2009, and they opened it up as a museum. So similarly, many of Susanna's belongings have been damaged over time, and the fact that she moved about 9 times in her life and was in multiple war zones didn't exactly help with our collection of her possessions. But we do have a few items here that belong to her. We have her family Bible, which would have at the time been very common, that it was a genealogical and family history record as well. It included marriages and family trees and that sort of thing. On top of that, we have a couple items from her bureau. We have a mirror and a soap dish that are quite lovely. And then lastly, we have a small chest of drawers gifted to her by Hannig over there. So yeah, that's about it in terms of our permanent collection. The rest are either replicas or from the time period. For example, this dress is not actually hers, but it was an 1870s walking dress. And obviously not something you would have worn in this heat, but was a common thing in slightly chillier weather. The last thing of note that I would point out is this quilt here, which was actually created for the opening. It's signed by many of the descendants of the survivors of the Alamo. So they both have their signatures and how they're related to some of the original survivors. And many of them attended the opening, and it's quite neat that we have that. But aside from that, that's mostly their story. Do you have any questions at all?
About the quilt.
Yeah.
I had a question about. So before the Alamo was raided, they happened to write their names and so forth on there?
So that's actually, it's just the descendants.
Just the descendants.
So it's the people who are, they're primarily still alive. Some of them have passed away, but that was very recent. So we know of many of the descendants, and some of them, one of the Esparzas is actually works with this foundation, and she works for the city.
And where is the museum, or where is the
Theo Henry?
No, I'm trying to think of
The bullet?
the bullock. Yes, ma'am.
You know, I'm not really sure how you get there from here. I really don't know. I've only lived here for about a year now.
Oh, okay.
So,
And then also, where is the cemetery located, if they want it? And what does that actually pertain to?
So Oakwood Cemetery is just on the other side of 35. You can't miss it. It's the really big one. And it's like in East Austin. But it is, my coworker could tell you a lot more because she's worked there. Many of us have actually worked there. I didn't, but it's one of the oldest cemeteries in Austin, and it's where many significant people were buried. It's definitely, it's worth checking out, and the chapel is always open as a museum as well.
Okay.
So people can take you for tours.
Yeah, I'll be more than happy to take a look at that.
For sure. And if you want to find Susanna and Joseph's gravestones, there's an image of them right there. Susanna's grave was actually
it would be what, this one right here?
Yeah, the marble one. her original gravestone was replaced by one that was a lot grander and was more of a memorial not too long ago. So yeah, that's Joseph when he was younger. This is old Joseph.
Old Joseph? There's a young Joseph and an old Joseph.
Joseph and an old Joseph. And it's pretty funny when these pictures were taken. So the younger one, he was in his early 20s. And this was Susanna, the same picture that we have of her in both places. She was in her early 40s. So it's quite evident the age gap between the two.
From what? When she got first married, she was 30.
So when she got first married, she was 15. And
her husband was
30.
Her
so
husband was 30.
And then when she finally married again, she was twice the age of her husband. So yeah, and these are stereoscopes, which were really common at the time.
I was going to ask you what these things are.
Yeah, so they were a very common form of entertainment during Victorian times, where basically you put a photo in it and you hold it up and you shift it forward until you can see it properly. And it's just kind of a fun entertainment.
It's one of those things.
Yeah, it was just, a way to...
Please touch gently.
Yeah, so the photos themselves are original. The actual stereoscopes are replicas. And yeah, these are some photographs of old Austin. We also have a map in there that's quite interesting.
Yeah, it was my grandmother that told me to move to Austin.
Really?
Mm-hmm.
So where did you say you're from originally?
I'm from South Texas. I'm from Corpus Christi.
Oh, okay, cool. Yeah.
Well, my grandmother remembers Austin when it was in the 1980s.
That's so cool. Yeah, my great grandmother grew up in Corpus as well.
Yeah. She only remembers when it was like in the 1980s. She doesn't know what Austin looks like or become now.
That's hilarious.
Mm-hmm. Like in my family is we actually don't have children till we're like much older in life, so it's kind of my great grandmother was still alive when she was telling me stories when they would be playing around with the Indians.
Yeah.
Because like we were like really like older like kind of people. It's crazy.
Wow, yeah, that is a long time ago.
Yeah.
It really is. That's such an interesting history.
Yeah, sure. she would tell us stories and so forth about that. And
that's very, very cool. Yeah, Texas history is fascinating. It's unlike any other history.
So what else is in these other rooms that you'd want me asking?
So again, the temporary exhibit is about the other
about everybody else?
Yeah, so everybody else.
So what does everybody else pertain?
So there are quite a few people. Joe Travis is again very famous as being the other, eyewitness account of what happened, because he was an adult at the time and was able to recount the tale again and again. And he had quite an interesting life as well. So there's actually an entire book about him that I'm about to read. But
okay, where exactly can we get those books?
I can show you in there. So
okay.
Most of them probably have to be specially ordered because I'm sure they're not in print anymore. But our Texas library is like what we have in that other room. It's just a huge collection of books on the history of Texas. So most of them are on loan from the Bullock or registered for the Bullock. So yes, Madame Candelaria is my favorite. She was actually, as far as we know, we do believe that she nursed James Bowie, and that's why she was there. So she was a Tejano American, so she was ethnically Mexican, but living in Texas as a Texan. And she was, when she spent time at the Alamo, again, she said that she was a nurse to Bowie. We believe this part is true, but she is my favorite because she's the type of person we want to invite to a dinner party. Her stories were very interesting, and they would change every single time she told them. So she actually changed the narrative of what happened at the Alamo pretty much every time that you asked her. And she told some wild stories. For example, there's one over here that she claimed that Amaron Dickinson jumped from a bell tower with a rope around his waist with his child, and that's how he died, with his son. We know that he didn't have a son. We know that there's no reason that that would be true. He died in battle. It's the most outlandish thing you can think of.
Could she have had dementia or so forth or any of that?
She just made them up.
She was
a character. She owned a flamenco hall. That was her main job. But she also, after the Alamo, she was living in San Antonio, and she turned herself basically into a living tourist attraction. So
wow.
She would tell the stories to people who came in and made money from doing that. So she was a real character. She's pretty excellent, and I have to show people that picture because I mean.
That's quite an amazing picture.
It really
an
is.
Amazing story. So she gave a different story every single time that she.
She sure did.
Wow.
Yeah.
What else do we have?
So there are some other survivors. There was a.
So exactly how many days did the Alamo go on?
The Alamo went on for 13 days. And it wasn't until the final day that the actual fighting began. So they were holed up for that long. Again, 2 Tejano American women who survived. And she's particularly interesting because she was part of Stephen F. Austin's Old 300. Her husband was, at least, which were the first people to settle down in Texas. With Stephen F. Austin got what was called an impresario contract, which is what settlers would get who owned colonies. They got permission from the government and basically a document that said that they could bring in however many families. And he was the first to do that.
Oh, wow.
So those families are famous. This is Enrique Esparza, who was a child at the time. And he, also had an interesting life. He was a Tejano American, and this I believe this is just from his family. Yes, it belonged to his brother. But it's an old instrument. What's it called?
An accordion?
Bandonion is what it's called. And I would love to see it played. I've never seen it before, but it's pretty fascinating.
Can imagine. Yes, man.
Yeah, and those are most of the main stories that we have. There were a couple of other survivors as well. And so feel free to look through there. But in terms of other items we have in here, both of these things are replicas.
I would assume that.
No.
I can imagine that walking down 6th Street with that on.
Yeah, exactly.
Nobody would even notice.
No, probably not in Austin. They really wouldn't. I feel like I've seen similar things before.
They just think he's a cosplayer.
Exactly. I do think it's pretty funny that, I don't know that it's funny, but it's pretty crazy that many of the Mexican troops, especially because they couldn't afford boots and boots weren't issued, they would wear sandals that were just like that. So most people wore those sandals into battle.
They wore flip-flops to battle.
Yeah, exactly. Wow, man, that must have been uncomfortable.
They might have been the most comfortable death they ever had.
Yeah, that's true. Maybe they were like Birkenstocks.
Yeah, maybe.
Yeah. Do you have any other questions?
So exactly like how many survivors? It was 21 is what you said?
21.
21, and it was all women and children at that point, correct?
Children and also enslaved people. I believe Joe may have been, no. I think Sam.
Hey, how are you, ma'am?
Sam and Charlie. Yeah, Sam and Charlie were the two other enslaved men who were there.
Oh, okay. They actually said survivor. I feel like an idiot.
Yeah, so when people say, okay, actually, Buddy as well, but when people say, you can hear them very loudly, and they used to say, Susanna Dickinson was the only survivor of the Alamo, and now they say she was the only adult female survivor of the Alamo, which is also completely untrue, but they're getting a little warmer. So every day, they get a little closer.
Okay.
But we have people come in and they're like, what? They're survivors? But they told us.
Oh no, like I remember when I would go, they would take us to Antonio. We would only go to.
Oh yeah, you get a different story at the Alamo for sure.
Yeah.